Alrighty, I'm going to talk about Part 2, Chapter 3 of Theology of the Body. He gave them the law of life as their inheritance. So in this section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a couple of different elements. I'm going to talk about JP2's Theology of the Body. I'm also going to make some connections to what we've read in Love and Responsibility. And I'm also going to just bring in his analysis of Humanae Vitae, because a lot of what he talks about in this section refers back to what's in that document. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, he talks about the conjugal act, and he points out the two dimensions of the conjugal act, those being the unitive and the procreative elements of the act. And he explains that this is a moral norm that can be understood through a proper interpretation of the true language of the body that we've just walked through. But he also points out that the unitive and procreative aspects of the conjugal act, which are inseparable, are also rooted in biblical revelation and also in the personalistic norm that he describes in Love and Responsibility. So the combination of the true language of the body, the biblical background, and the personalistic norm create this moral norm for the conjugal act, where it has both a unitive and procreative dimension to it. From there, he moves into responsible parenthood. Now, responsible parenthood, as I have written here, I'm hoping you can read it all right, is judgments regarding the raising of children that consider a variety of factors that center around God's will. So responsible parenthood is not just about having children, when to have children, but it's actually the raising of children as well. But it has a lot to do with planning when God's calling you to have children. So it's not just an arbitrary decision of right now as a couple we don't want children, whether it's for personal reasons or preferential reasons. It's not an arbitrary thing, but rather it's for the good of my family, for the good of society, for the good of my community, or whatever other important factors that there might be. Right now is not the time to have children, or now is the time to have children. So it doesn't just have to do with not having children, but really the key to it is prudence. Practicing the virtue of prudence, making a prudent decision of, all right, God is calling us to have children right now. We're in a state right now where God's telling us to be open to expanding our family. And so he moves from there into talking about periodic continence. Periodic continence is a fancy way of referring to abstaining from sex for a period of time for a married couple. Now, there's a lot of elements of periodic continence that he discusses in Theology of the Body. First of all, the virtue of chastity is at the center of periodic continence because it requires a self-discipline, right? Mutual self-discipline and self-control over the desires of the body. Second of all, it's good for your marriage, and it grows your relationship because it creates a mutual dialogue between the two people in a marriage, between the two spouses, that otherwise might not be there. Thirdly, it acknowledges the self as a minister of God's design. So instead of saying that I am master of my own life, it's being obedient to the design that God has given us in our bodies, right? So it's a right, proper, true understanding of the language of the body that has been gone over already. Also, he points out periodic continence is not just a technique, but it's an ethic. So it's not just a biological, scientific understanding, but it's rather almost an ethical code that we are that we are submissive to. It's more than just a biology, but it's rather a correspondence to the truth of personhood and dignity as free, rational beings. I don't know if you can see that. I'll shrink this down here. So I'll read that one more time. Periodic continence has to do with more than just biology, but it's a correspondence to the truth of personhood and the dignity of a free, rational being. So really, again, it goes back to the language of the body. Periodic continence respects the language of the body, and it respects nature and the way that God designed us. rather than trying to take control of it ourselves. And finally, points out that practice is essential. So growth in chastity, especially for men, any man who, for instance, has practiced chastity and self-discipline in his own personal life, and then gotten into a relationship, with another, knows the challenge that comes with practicing chastity in that relationship. It's a whole nother game. It's a whole nother ballpark than chastity when you're outside of a relationship. And so that's something that JP2 emphasizes in Theology of the Body. Now I'd like to move to a list of distinctions between periodic continence and contraception. So John Paul II outlines some of the differences between the two, because many people following Humanae Vitae disagreed with the Church's teaching, and they didn't really understand the distinction between periodic continence and contraception, right? A lot of people would look at that and say, well, they're both aimed at preventing having children. Well, there's a much deeper dimension to that, rooted in the language of the body and the personalistic norm. So, first of all, periodic continence is morally licit, contraception is morally illicit. And then here's kind of the reasons why. So periodic continence, it respects nature. It respects, again, the language of the body, the built-in nature of fertility that is central to the human person, whereas contraception obstructs nature. Periodic continence involves self-mastery, self-denial, and self-gift. Overall, it just requires the practice of virtue. Contraception does not require these things. Rather, it promotes obsession, possession, and manipulation for selfish reasons or for personal gain. Rather than being self-gift, it's a manipulation of oneself and of nature for the sake of pleasure. Also, periodic continence respects the bond between sex and fertility. It recognizes fertility as an essential element of sex, whereas contraception tries to separate sex from fertility, and it denies both the unitive and the procreative elements of the conjugal act. Periodic continence enhances love because it creates that mutual dialogue between couples, whereas contraception inhibits love because it's not about that mutual dialogue, but rather it's taking control of oneself, one's sexual life. And finally, periodic continence is other-oriented, whereas contraception is self-centered. And again, it goes back to that mutual dialogue between the two spouses. Finally, I want to talk about the spiritual dimension of Humanae Vitae that John Paul II dives into in Theology of the Body. So the spiritual dimension of Humanae Vitae, first of all, he clarifies that marital love is a gift from the Holy Spirit, and it's dependent on cooperation with God. Secondly, true conjugal love involves both of the dimensions of the conjugal act, both personal communion and responsible parenthood. Thirdly, rightly ordered conjugal love does not begin in the bedroom. And this is something that Dr. Swafford has talked about in class, how conjugal love, it doesn't just happen right when you walk into the bedroom or when you get in bed with your spouse, but rather it's a self-giving climax of erotic love that manifests the mutual affection of both spouses. And that has to do with both the sensual and emotional affection that is referred to in Love and Responsibility by JP2. Also, marital love reveres Christ. It puts Christ at the center of the relationship, and it unfolds the mystery of vocation between man and woman. John Paul II talks about how married love is a challenge. It has to do with the narrow way that Christ refers to in the Gospels. Next, prayer and sacraments are essential to holy marriage. Right, going back to how marital love is a gift from the Holy Spirit, is dependent on cooperation with God. So in order to have that healthy marital relationship, that holy marriage, we need grace in our lives. Finally, spiritual, divinely ordered interior, proper marital love involves a spiritual, divinely ordered interior climate that acknowledges the language of the body and fosters interior harmony and speaks true love. So that's kind of how John Paul II wraps up this section. He describes the spiritual divine nature involved in the gift of self and marital love. And it respects both the language of the body, and so he talks about, right, the inseparability of divine love and truth. And he talks about how that is brought to fruition in rightly ordered marital love.